New York City did not sleep, it vibrated. It was a cacophony of sirens, subway rumbles, and the relentless, aggressive ambition that coursed through the concrete veins of Manhattan. But high above the gridlock, on the 88th floor of the Lancaster Tower, the noise was different. Here, the chaos was muffled by thick velvet curtains and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. The air smelled of expensive perfume, truffle oil, and the metallic tang of desperate networking. For Daisy, moving through the crowded ballroom was an exercise in erasure. She was 26, dressed in the uniform black slacks and crisp white shirt of the catering staff, holding a silver tray laden with canapés that cost more than her monthly rent. To the guests, she was not a person. She was a floating tray, a mechanism for delivery. They reached for the hors d'oeuvres without pausing their conversations, their eyes sliding over her face as if she were made of glass. Daisy was used to it. In fact, she counted on it. Invisibility was her cloak, and beneath it, she was not just a server, she was an observer. She was a writer, or at least she tried to be. Her tiny apartment in the Bronx was stacked floor to ceiling with rejection letters from publishers who found her prose too quiet or her stories lacking commercial appeal. They wanted loud. They wanted scandal. Daisy dealt in the currency of small, heartbreaking moments, the kind that went unnoticed in a city screaming for attention. She collected these moments like rare coins. Tonight, she watched a senator's wife subtly check her reflection in a spoon, terrified of aging. She watched a young tech mogul laugh too loudly at a bad joke, desperate for approval. And she watched Owen Lancaster. The truth is a quiet thing in a screaming world. Owen was the reason they were all here. The Lancaster Gala was the crown jewel of the social season, a celebration of his firm's record-breaking fiscal year. Owen stood near the center of the room, a gravitational singularity in a tuxedo. He was tall, with the kind of broad shoulders that seemed built to carry the weight of the market. His face was sharp, defined by a jawline that suggested stubbornness and eyes the color of dark espresso, intense, alert, and entirely unreadable. He was surrounded. Men wanted his investment tips. Women wanted his gaze. He gave them neither. He nodded. He shook hands. He offered the polite, practiced smile of a man who had long ago learned that wearing a mask was safer than showing his skin. But Daisy, standing in the periphery with her tray of untouched tartlets, saw what the others missed. She saw the way his hand twitched against his side, a rhythmic tapping of his thumb against his thigh. She saw the way his eyes darted to the exit signs every few minutes, like a trapped animal calculating the distance to freedom. He was the most powerful man in the room, and he looked like he was suffocating. Daisy felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. She knew that feeling. She felt it every time she opened a rejection email, every time she served a meal she couldn't afford to buy. It was the feeling of being trapped in a life that didn't fit the shape of your soul. She retreated to the relative sanctuary of the terrace. It was a bitterly cold November night, and the heavy glass doors were closed, sealing the heat inside. The terrace was empty, abandoned by the guests who preferred the warmth of their egos. Daisy set her tray down on a side table. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, battered notebook and a cheap ballpoint pen. Her hands were shaking from the cold, but the urge to write was a physical ache. She needed to capture the look in Owen Lancaster's eyes before it faded. She needed to write down the tragedy of a king who hated his throne. She leaned against the stone railing, the wind whipping her loose strands of hair across her face, and began to scribble. The words flowed fast and messy, a release of the tension she had carried all night. She wrote about the noise, the glass, the mask. She was so lost in the rhythm of the sentences that she didn't hear the heavy door slide open. She didn't hear the footsteps, leather on stone, approach her. "It's freezing out here," a voice said. The sound was deep, resonant, and startled Daisy so badly she nearly dropped her notebook. She spun around, clutching the paper to her chest like a shield. Owen Lancaster stood there. He had shed the crowd, but he still wore the exhaustion. He was looking at her, not through her. For the first time all night, the billionaire's gaze wasn't scanning the room for threats or opportunities. It was fixed squarely on her face. I'm sorry, sir," Daisy stammered, the wind stealing her breath. "I was just taking a break. I'll go back inside." "Don't," Owen said. He walked to the railing, standing a few feet away from her. He didn't look at her tray. He didn't ask for a drink. He looked out at the sprawling, glittering grid of the city below. "I came out here to escape the noise. If you go back in, you'll just let it out." He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was no class divide in the wind. The cold bit them both equally. "What were you writing?" Daisy gripped the notebook tighter. "Nothing, sir. Just notes." "Notes on the canapes?" Owen asked, a dry, humorless quirk touching his lips. "Notes on the people," Daisy corrected him, her writer's pride flaring up despite her fear. "The canapes are boring. The people are tragic." Owen froze. The mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of genuine shock. No one spoke to him like that. No one called his world tragic. They called it aspirational. "And what did you write about me?" Owen asked, his voice dropping, losing its corporate polish. He stepped closer, the scent of expensive cedar and cold rain surrounding him. "Am I tragic or just boring?" Daisy looked up at him. She was invisible to everyone else, a ghost in a black uniform. But right now, under the harsh lights of the city, she felt dangerously real. She weighed the risk of honesty against the safety of silence. "I wrote that you look like a man holding his breath," Daisy whispered, the wind carrying her words to him, waiting for permission to exhale. The silence that followed was absolute. Owen stared at her, stunned. He had spent millions on PR firms to craft his image, on therapists to manage his stress, yet the shivering waitress had dismantled him in one sentence. He looked at the notebook in her hand, then back at her eyes, realizing with a jolt of adrenaline that for the first time in years, someone had actually seen him. The glass wall between the billionaire and the server didn't shatter. It simply dissolved into the cold night air, leaving them standing on the precipice of a connection neither of them could afford. The wind on the terrace seemed to hold its breath, caught between the billionaire and the waitress. Owen Lancaster didn't step back. He didn't retreat into the armor of his tuxedo or the safety of his net worth. He stood there, exposed by a single sentence from a woman whose name he didn't even know, letting the cold air sting his face. "Holding my breath," Owen repeated, the words tasting strange on his tongue. He looked at Daisy, really looked at her, noticing for the first time that her eyes were not just dark, but a deep, flecked hazel, intelligent and terrified. "And if I exhale, what happens?" "Then the tower might fall," Daisy whispered, clutching her notebook so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Or you might finally be able to sleep. For a long, suspended moment, the sounds of the gala inside, the laughter, the clinking glass, felt like a distant transmission from a foreign planet. Here in the cold, there was only the raw friction of two souls recognizing a shared frequency. Owen reached out, his hand hovering inches from her notebook. It was an instinctual movement, a desire to touch the source of such terrifying insight. But the door slid open. A burst of warm air and loud jazz music shattered the silence. A young associate stuck his head out, his face flushed with alcohol. "Mr. Lancaster, the investors from Tokyo are asking for you. The toast is in 5 minutes." The spell broke. The mask of the CEO slammed back onto Owen's face, instant and impenetrable. He straightened his spine, the vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of polished indifference. He looked at the associate, gave a curt nod, and then turned back to Daisy. But the connection was severed. He was once again the Titan, and she was once again the help. "Go inside," Owen commanded softly, though his eyes lingered on her face for a second too long. "It's too cold for you out here." He turned and walked back into the light, leaving Daisy alone in the dark with her notebook and her pounding heart. We build walls to keep the world out, never realizing we are locking ourselves in. The next few days were a blur of gray routine for Daisy. She returned to her cramped apartment in the Bronx, to the stack of rejection letters, and to the silence of her unread stories. But something had shifted. The city noise felt louder, the invisibility heavier. She found herself staring at the blank pages of her notebook, unable to write about anything but the haunted look in Owen Lancaster's eyes. She didn't expect to see him again. Their worlds were parallel lines, destined never to intersect. But fate, it seemed, had no respect for geometry. 3 days later, Daisy was assigned a shift at the Lancaster offices. Not a gala this time, but a private executive luncheon in the firm's library. The room was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, smelling of old paper and money. Daisy was clearing the remains of the meal, stacking porcelain plates with practiced silence. The executives had left hours ago. She thought she was alone. She moved to the large oak table to collect the final coffee cup. As she reached for it, she noticed a file left open. It was a dense grid of numbers, stock projections, and profit margins. To Daisy, it looked like a cage made of math. "It's a map," a voice said from the shadows of the bookshelves. Daisy gasped, nearly dropping the cup. Owen was sitting in a high-backed wing chair in the corner, a book resting forgotten on his lap. He wasn't wearing his jacket. His tie was gone, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the human beneath the executive. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes stark in the afternoon light. "Sir," Daisy breathed, retreating to the safety of her role. "I didn't see you." "I'll leave." "Don't," Owen said. He stood up, closing the distance between them. The library felt suddenly small. "You said I looked like I was holding my breath." "You were right." He stopped at the other side of the table, looking down at the spreadsheet she had been staring at. "This is my life." He paused, waiting. "Daisy," she supplied softly. "Daisy," Owen said, the name sounding like a prayer in the quiet room. "This file is a map of everything I own, but it doesn't tell me where I am. You saw me clearly in the dark, Daisy. Can you see me in the light?" The question was a dangerous invitation. It was a hand extended across a chasm of class and propriety. Daisy looked at him, feeling the pull, the undeniable gravity of his loneliness calling to hers. "I see a man who reads books in a room built for counting money," Daisy said, gesturing to the volume he had abandoned on the chair. It was a collection of poetry. Owen smiled, a faint, genuine thing that transformed his face. "Guilty. It's the only place where the numbers stop screaming." He walked around the table, coming to stand next to her. He was close enough that she could smell the coffee and cedarwood clinging to him. The proximity was dizzying. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek fountain pen. He held it out to her. "I saw your pen the other night," Owen murmured. "It was running out of ink. A writer should never be without a voice." It was a gift, a small, expensive, intimate gift. Daisy looked at the pen, gleaming in the library light. To accept it was to accept his attention, to acknowledge that they were no longer strangers. "I can't take this, Mr. Lancaster," Daisy said, stepping back, her hands behind her back. "I'm just the caterer. It wouldn't be right." "Take it," Owen urged, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Not as a payment, as a trade. You gave me a truth. I'm giving you a tool." He took her hand, her rough, working hand, and pressed the cold metal of the pen into her palm. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending a jolt of electricity through her that made her knees weak. It was a forbidden touch, a violation of every unwritten rule of their society. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, hand in hand, the silence filled with the terrifying possibility of what might happen next. A touch can be a promise or a warning, sometimes it is both. Then, the heavy double doors of the library swung open. "Owen, are you in here?" The voice was sharp, polished, and demanding. A woman stepped in. She was beautiful in a way that felt manufactured. Sleek blonde hair, a tailored suit that cost more than Daisy's life earnings, and eyes that assessed the room like a predator scanning for weakness. This was Isabella, Owen's business partner, and, according to the tabloids, the woman destined to merge her empire with his. Isabella stopped. Her gaze dropped instantly to their joined hands. Owen pulled back as if burned, the connection snapping violently. Daisy took a stumbling step backward, clutching the pen to her chest, her face burning with shame. "Isabella," Owen said, his voice instantly cooling, the walls slamming back up. "I was just giving instructions to the staff." Isabella looked at Daisy, then at the pen, then at Owen. A cold, knowing smile curled her lips. She didn't buy it. She saw the tension. She saw the spark, and she decided to stomp it out immediately. "Instructions," Isabella drawled, walking over to slip her arm through Owen's, reclaiming her territory. "Well, finish up. The board is waiting for the quarterly review. And Owen, darling, you know we don't fraternize with the help. It confuses them." She looked at Daisy with a dismissal, so absolute it felt like a slap. "You can go, and leave the pen. We don't want to accuse you of stealing." Daisy looked at Owen. She waited for him to defend her. She waited for him to tell the truth. But Owen looked at the floor, his jaw tight, trapped by the expectations of his world. He didn't speak. Daisy placed the pen gently on the table. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. She turned and walked out, invisible once again, leaving the pen and the man behind. But as she fled down the corridor, she knew one thing. He had seen her. And the way he had looked at her before the doors opened was a secret that could burn his entire empire to the ground. For 5 days, the fountain pen lay on Daisy's bedside table like an unexploded bomb. It was sleek, heavy, and expensive, a jagged piece of Owen Lancaster's world that had punctured the hull of her own. She tried to write with it, but the ink wouldn't flow. The memory of his silence in the library, the way he had let Isabella dismiss her like a stray dog, had paralyzed her hand. Daisy went back to her routine, but the invisibility that had once been her shield now felt like a shroud. She wasn't just unseen, she was erased. She avoided the catering shifts at the Lancaster Tower. She took jobs in Brooklyn, in Queens, anywhere the skyline didn't remind her of espresso eyes and broken promises. But the city, vast as it was, felt incredibly small when fate decided to close its fist, and on a rainy Tuesday evening, Daisy was leaving her shift at a small jazz club in the village. The alley was dark, slick with oil and rain. She pulled her coat tighter, head down against the wind, when a silhouette stepped out from the shadows of the brick wall that it was Owen that he wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed in a dark wool coat, the collar turned up, his hair dampened by the drizzle. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who had walked a long way to find something he lost. "You're hard to find," Owen said, his voice rough, lacking its usual boardroom cadence. Daisy stopped, her heart hammering a traitorous rhythm against her ribs. "I don't want to be found, Mr. Lancaster. Especially not by you." "Owen," he corrected, stepping closer. He didn't invade her space. He stopped at a respectful distance, allowing the rain to fall between them. "I came to return this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not the pen, but a folded napkin. It was from the gala, the very first night. On it, in Daisy's distinct, messy scrawl, were the words she had written about the guests. The tragic king holding his breath. "I found it on the terrace," Owen said quietly. "I've read it 100 times. You saw me, Daisy. You saw the part of me I spend millions trying to hide. And you let your partner treat me like a thief," Daisy countered, the hurt sharp in her voice. "You stood there and said nothing." "I was a coward," Owen admitted, the confession stark and unvarnished. I froze. In my world, silence is safety. But I haven't slept since you walked out of that library. I don't want the silence anymore. I want to know what else you've written. The vulnerability in his eyes was disarming. It stripped away her defenses. He wasn't offering money or excuses. He was offering his attention, the most valuable currency he possessed. Daisy looked at him, shivering in the rain, and made a choice that terrified her. She reached into her bag and pulled out her battered notebook. It was dog-eared, stained with coffee, and filled with her soul, her observations, her pain, her stories. It was the only thing of value she owned. "This isn't a ledger, Owen," she whispered, handing it to him. "It's me. If you lose this, you lose me." Owen took the notebook as if it were made of ancient glass. "I will guard it with my life," he promised. "I just want to hear your voice in a way that I can't be interrupted. Trust is a fragile thread we spin from our own hope, praying it will hold the weight of another person." He took the notebook. He took her trust, and for 24 hours, the world felt possible. The next morning, Daisy received a call. It wasn't Owen. It was his executive assistant. Mr. Lancaster requested her presence at the tower. Not to work. To talk. Hope, bright and blinding, flared in Daisy's chest. She dressed in her best clothes, which were still modest by Manhattan standards, and took the subway to the tower. The elevator ride to the 88th floor felt different this time. She wasn't the help. She was the invited guest. She was ushered into the main conference room. But Owen wasn't there. Isabella was. She sat at the head of the long marble table, looking like a statue carved from ice and malice. In front of her, lying open on the polished stone, was Daisy's notebook. Daisy stopped in the doorway, the blood draining from her face. "Where is Owen?" "Owen is busy acquiring a tech firm in Silicon Valley," Isabella said, her voice smooth and bored. She flipped a page of the notebook with a manicured nail. "He left this morning. But he left this little project with me." "He wouldn't," Daisy whispered. "He promised." "Oh, honey," Isabella laughed, a cruel, tinkling sound. "Owen promises a lot of things. It's his job to make people feel special so he can get what he wants. He was amused by you. The writer Waitress. It's a quaint story to tell at parties. He showed me some of these passages over breakfast. We had a good laugh. The Tragic King. Really? It's a bit melodramatic, don't you think?" Daisy felt as if the floor had opened up beneath her. He had shared it. He had taken the most private parts of her soul and read them aloud to this woman over coffee. The betrayal was so absolute it made her physically nauseous. "Give it back," Daisy choked out, stepping forward. "Of course," Isabella said, closing the notebook. She slid it across the long table. It stopped halfway, isolated on the cold expanse of marble. Then Isabella placed a check on top of it. Daisy looked at the number. It was $50,000. "Owen feels bad about wasting your time," Isabella explained, checking her watch. "He thinks you have potential, but clearly you're struggling. Consider this a consulting fee for the entertainment. Take the money, pay off your debts, and don't come back. The security desk has been instructed to flag your name. The truth is a quiet thing in a screaming world, and the truth screaming in Daisy's mind was that she had been a fool. She had believed that a man from the sky could love a girl from the ground. She realized now that to him, her pain was just content, her life just a diversion. $50,000 was life-changing money for her. It was rent for 3 years. It was freedom. But right now, it looked like blood money. Daisy walked to the table. She picked up the notebook, feeling the paper burn her skin. She looked at the check, then up at Isabella. "Tell Mr. Lancaster," Daisy said, her voice shaking with a quiet, devastating dignity, "that he can buy the silence of everyone else in the city. But he couldn't afford my words." She ripped the check in half. The sound was sharp, tearing through the quiet luxury of the room. She let the pieces flutter to the marble floor. "They were free," Daisy whispered, "and he threw them away." She didn't wait for Isabella's shocked expression. She turned and walked out of the conference room, out of the tower, and into the blinding noon sun. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of hope. The notebook in her hand felt heavy, like a dead thing. She had given Owen Lancaster the only part of herself that mattered, and he had turned it into a joke. She descended into the dark subway, determined to bury her dreams alongside her foolish heart. The silence in the conference room of the Lancaster Tower was not peaceful, it was radioactive. Daisy had left hours ago, leaving behind the check and the ghost of her dignity, but the air still felt charged with the static of her departure. Owen Lancaster walked in at 4 p.m. He looked nothing like the man Isabella had described to Daisy. He wasn't in Silicon Valley acquiring a tech firm. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes rimmed with red. He hadn't been on a plane. He had been in the hospital chapel down the street, sitting in silence, wrestling with the demons Daisy's notebook had unearthed in him. He had returned to the tower to tell Isabella that he was dissolving the partnership, that the notebook had awakened a part of him he thought was dead. He expected to find an empty room. Instead, he found Isabella sitting at the head of the table, sipping sparkling water, the $10,000 check resting on the marble like a trophy. "You're back early," Isabella said, her voice tight. "I handled the distraction. You can thank me later." Owen stopped. He looked at the check. Then he looked at the empty space on the table where he had left his briefcase, the briefcase containing the notebook he had sworn to guard with his life. He had left it for 10 minutes to take a crisis call in the soundproof booth. 10 minutes. "Where is it?" Owen asked. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. "The diary?" Isabella rolled her eyes. "I gave it back to the little mouse, along with a generous severance. I told her you had a good laugh about her tragic king metaphor. She took the news theatrically." Owen felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a cold, white-hot fury. "You told her I laughed?" "I told her what she needed to hear to leave you alone, Owen," Isabella snapped, standing up. "We have a merger to close. You cannot be distracted by a catering girl with a savior complex. I did you a favor. I cleaned up your mess." "She wasn't a mess," Owen whispered, the realization crashing over him. "She was the only thing in this building that wasn't for sale. Betrayal is not always a knife in the back. Sometimes it is a lie whispered in the ear of the one you love." He looked at Isabella, the perfect partner, the perfect reflection of the soulless world he inhabited, and the cord finally snapped. "The merger is off," Owen said. Isabella froze. "Excuse me." "I said it's off. I'm pulling my capital. I'm dissolving the firm." "You can't," Isabella hissed, her composure cracking. "You will lose billions. You will be a pariah on Wall Street." "I don't care," Owen roared, the sound echoing off the glass walls. "I would rather be bankrupt than be the man you just described to her." He grabbed the check from the table and tore it in half. Then he turned and ran. He didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs, 2 at a time, shedding the weight of the tower with every step. He burst out onto the street, into the blinding noise of Manhattan, and realized he didn't know where she lived. He knew her soul, he knew her words, but he didn't know her address. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking, and dialed the catering agency. He didn't use his assistant. He used his own voice, threatening, begging, until the terrified manager gave him an address in the Bronx. It began to rain again, a heavy, washing deluge that slicked the streets. Owen got into his car, ignoring the driver, and took the wheel himself. He drove aggressively, crossing the bridge, leaving the skyline behind, driving into the neighborhoods the people in his tower only saw on the news. He found her building. It was a walk-up with peeling paint and bars on the windows. He climbed the 4 flights of stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. "Daisy," Please. The door opened a crack. The chain was still on. Daisy stood there, her eyes swollen, holding the notebook against her chest like a shield. When she saw him, she didn't open the door. She tried to slam it shut. "Go away!" she cried. "Haven't you mocked me enough? I never laughed." Owen shouted through the wood, pressing his forehead against the doorframe. "I never showed her the book, Daisy. She stole it from my briefcase while I was on a call. I didn't go to Silicon Valley. I was sitting in a chapel reading your words, trying to figure out how to be the man you think I am." The pressure on the door eased slightly. Silence stretched between them, heavy and wet. "She said you read it over breakfast," Daisy whispered, her voice trembling. "She said you called it melodramatic." "I called it a mirror," Owen said, his voice breaking. "Daisy, please, open the door. I can prove it." Slowly, the chain rattled. The door opened. Daisy stood there, looking small and broken. Owen stepped into the cramped hallway. He didn't try to touch her. He stood there, dripping wet, looking at her with a desperation that stripped him naked. "Page 42, Owen said softly. Daisy blinked. "What?" "Page 42, Owen repeated, locking eyes with her. "You wrote, 'He wears his power like a coat he borrowed from a dead man, terrified that if he takes it off, he will freeze.'" Daisy gasped. That was a line she had written months ago, buried deep in the middle of the book. "Page 80, Owen continued, stepping closer, reciting from memory. "The city screams, but he listens to the silence between the sirens, wishing he knew the language." Tears welled in Daisy's eyes. He hadn't just skimmed it. He had devoured it. He had memorized the parts that spoke to his own hidden pain. "I didn't laugh, Daisy," Owen whispered, reaching out a hand but stopping short of touching her. "I wept, because for 30 years I have been invisible to everyone who claims to know me. And then you, a stranger with a tray of canapes, walked in and wrote my name on a page. The truth is a quiet thing in a screaming world. You saw me," Owen said, his voice cracking. "Isabella saw a distraction. The board saw a CEO. You saw the man holding his breath. And if you walk away now, I don't think I'll ever be able to exhale again." Daisy looked at him. She saw the rain dripping from his hair, the ruin of his expensive shoes, the raw, terrifying honesty in his dark eyes. The anger that had fueled her walk to the subway began to dissolve, replaced by the ache of recognition. He wasn't the enemy. He was just another casualty of the same war she was fighting, the war to be real in a fake world. She didn't hand him the notebook. She placed it on the small table by the door. Then she reached out and took his hand. It was cold, wet, and trembling. "You left the tower," she noted softly. "I left everything," Owen replied, gripping her hand as if it were a lifeline. "I dissolved the partnership. I'm done, Daisy. I'm done holding my breath." It wasn't a perfect fix. The betrayal still stung, the gap between their worlds was still vast, and the fallout of his decision would be catastrophic. But as they stood in the dim hallway of a Bronx tenement, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of the terrifying, beautiful promise of a story that was just beginning to be written. The reconciliation had started, not with a check, but with a quote. And in the quiet, the invisible girl and the tragic king found the only thing that mattered. They were finally looking at each other, and the view was clear. The storm that had battered the Bronx subsided by dawn, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean of gray. Inside the cramped apartment, the light filtered through the iron bars of the window, casting long, striped shadows across the floor. Owen Lancaster sat on the edge of Daisy's worn sofa, his ruined Italian leather shoes kicked into a corner, a mug of instant coffee in his hands. He hadn't left. He hadn't called a driver. For the first time in 30 years, the man who lived by the clock had nowhere to be, and nowhere he'd rather be. The fallout was, predictably, catastrophic. When Owen turned on his phone 2 days later, the digital world was on fire. The headlines were savage. Lancaster implodes. The Billionaire's meltdown. Isabella Stone takes the throne. Wall Street screamed its judgment. They called him unstable, reckless, a titan who had torched his own kingdom. But in the quiet of Daisy's apartment, Owen didn't look like a man amidst a meltdown. He looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy load. "They're calling you a fool," Daisy said softly, scrolling through a tablet at her small kitchen table. She looked up at him, worry etching a line between her brows. "They say you lost the empire." Owen took a sip of the bitter coffee, a faint, calm smile playing on his lips. "I liquidated the empire, Daisy. There's a difference. I sold my shares to Isabella this morning. She got the name, the tower, and the noise." He looked directly at her. "I kept the capital to start something small, something honest. A boutique firm where I actually know the names of the people I'm helping." He wasn't a fairy tale prince who became a pauper. He was a man who traded power for freedom. The transition was jarring but liberating. Owen traded the penthouse for a renovated brownstone in Brooklyn, still elegant but grounded. He traded the boardrooms for coffee shops and the deafening noise of Wall Street for the rhythmic clatter of Daisy's typewriter. Because Daisy was writing again. And this time, the ink flowed like water. She wrote furiously, fueled by the truth that had exploded between them. She wrote a novel about a glass tower and the ghosts trapped inside it. She wrote about the invisibility of the working class and the blindness of the elite. She didn't write for approval. She wrote for the man who read her drafts over breakfast, the man who treated every sentence like a revelation. A year later, on a crisp autumn evening, the air in the West Village smelled of rain and old paper. The independent bookstore was packed, not with socialites looking to be seen, but with readers looking to feel. It was the launch party for Daisy's debut novel, The Tragic King. Daisy stood at the podium. She wore a dress of deep emerald green, a color that made her hazel eyes shine. She looked out at the crowd, her hand steady on the microphone. She was no longer the ghost in the catering uniform. She was the voice in the room. Owen stood in the back, leaning against a philosophy shelf. He wore a simple charcoal blazer, no tie, his hands in his pockets. He watched her with a pride that burned brighter than any camera flash. He saw the way the audience leaned in. He saw that they finally saw her. Daisy cleared her throat, her gaze scanning the room until it locked onto his. The connection was instantaneous, a tether that held them together across the crowd. "I used to believe that to be seen you had to be loud," Daisy said, her voice clear and resonant. "I thought you had to own the building to matter. But I learned that the loudest things in the world are often the emptiest." She paused, her fingers brushing the cover of her book. The room was silent, hanging on her every word. "I learned that from a man who had the whole world watching him, but felt completely invisible. A man who taught me that the most expensive thing you can give someone isn't money, it's your attention." She opened the book to the dedication page. She didn't read it aloud, but Owen knew the words by heart. He had seen them the night the first copy arrived, and he had wept. To Owen, who learned to exhale. "This story," Daisy concluded, "is for anyone who feels like they are shouting into the void. I hear you." As the applause erupted, warm, genuine, and thunderous, Owen closed his eyes for a second, letting the sound wash over him. It was better than any stock market bell. Daisy navigated through the crowd, signing books with the sleek fountain pen Owen had given her in the library, the tool that had started it all. When the line finally dwindled, she found him in the corner. "You were incredible," Owen whispered, stepping out of the shadows to pull her close. "I was terrified," Daisy admitted, breathless, looking up at him. "But then I looked at the back of the room." "I told you," Owen said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm always looking. I never stopped." "You know," Daisy said, a playful but serious light in her eyes. "Isabella gave an interview yesterday. She said you ruined your life for a fleeting romance." Owen laughed, a low, rich sound that vibrated against her chest. Isabella counts money. I count moments. And looking at you right now, I'm the richest man in the city. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. I would burn the tower down 1,000 times just to stand here with you, Daisy. I don't miss the view from the top. I like the view from right here much better. The truth is a quiet thing in a screaming world. And in that quiet bookstore, surrounded by stories, they found their own ending. Owen kissed her, a slow, deliberate kiss that tasted of autumn and promise. They were no longer defined by what they had or what they lacked. They were defined by the clarity of their connection. They called her invisible because they were blind to the light, but he was the only one who saw her clearly because she was the only star in his sky. And finally, after a lifetime of holding his breath, the king exhaled, and the writer began page 1 of their new life.